Good afternoon. We're at the last but one session, so we will be try to keep it alive and exciting. I think the question here is about voice and Africa's voice. And people, I think, ask the question, why do we need voice? And we've had what I would call a lot of micro conversations in the last 3 sessions. This is the macro conversation. For the small and medium enterprise woman to get that loan at the right price, the state has to get the loan at the right price first, because then it trickles down. For you to have the right road, you need the right resources. I want to break the conversation on Africa's voice into 3 bits, and I'll come to the different panelists on all of those bits. The first one is about liquidity and access to resources. And just to give you a sense of why we're talking about voice, as we all know, when the COVID crisis hit, we all went out there and we talked a lot about the need for additional liquidity to help countries manage the crisis. It took us over a year to get that liquidity to start with, and when we finally got it as a continent, we only got 5% of everything that was released into the system. So this was sort of the first beginning, I think, of a realization that there was some kind of an injustice in the system. The second piece of liquidity that we got was what we all call the debt service suspension initiative, which delivered about $13 billion into the system. But it was very short term. It was 2 years, and then they said, oh, but for us to extend it, you know, then you will have to get into a debt restructuring conversation. You will have to do this, you'll have to do that. So even though we had an external crisis that was not Africa triggered, we couldn't get access to those resources. And finally, we do have in the IMF provisions a provision that says that when we have sustained deep crisis, the IMF should just trigger and ask for liquidity that needs to be generated. It was done in 2008 when we had the European financial crisis. It hasn't ever been done again. And Africa is heading into many more crises. For debt, the question on debt is a question that starts first with the need for more resources and access to liquidity, the cost of the resources that we have. All of Africa, for all the good conversations that we have, we don't have one investment-grade country. There is no investment-grade country on the continent, which means, very simply, that if I'm a pension fund, first of all, because of Basel rules, for me to invest in you, I have to provision more capital because you are more risky. This is somebody somewhere else has said, if you're going to lend money to a country that is not investment grade, then you must keep more money aside because of the probability that they will collapse. So we can de-risk, we can blend, we can do that, but there is an institution somewhere that has already said, we're going to fine you for doing this. And so there is a fundamental infrastructure around how we manage the risking. We've talked about the credit rating agencies, of course. We're talking even about the credit rating agencies for the World Bank, the IMF, and others. And I think it's not dissimilar to our countries and how we interact with rating agencies and what needs to be done. And then finally, of course, on climate. We all had long conversations around climate. And I think Jenda talked about gas. I think for 2 years we talked about, you know, should we fund gas? There was a decision by the multilateral development banks not to fund gas on the continent. And then the Russia-Ukraine war happened. And then everybody wanted gas from Africa. This is the fundamental injustice around climate. The second injustice is that we are suffering the effects of climate. But for us to be able to have access to concessional resources, we must meet conditionality. So even though I am drowning you because I did something wrong, you must then do something that I ask you to do before I can give you the resources to save you. And I think if you bring all of this together, this is why we have a conversation on voice today, is to say that there are such imbalances in the system that it is very difficult for Africa to emerge. The good news is that there are solutions. And we are at this tipping point in time where, because of the triple crises, Russia, Ukraine, COVID, of course, inflation, everybody is talking about how can we do something differently. And so for my panel today, each one of them is in a different phase of how can we do something differently. So I'm going to be asking each one of you, and I'm going to start with Masood, who was at the IMF, and everybody has read the bios, so I wouldn't talk about bios. Masood, today, if we had the IMF with us, what can we do? And of course, you read your handouts. The Africa voice of the IMF is 6.5%. So we don't have that much influence. We need the partners to be able to ask the IMF to do something different. What will that ask be?
I think if you wanted to get the IMF to truly respond, not just to the needs now, but to the projection of needs that we see for the next 5 years, first thing that we would ask it to do is to raise its own financing at least back to the levels that it had in 2020. Today, IMF financing for low-income countries has gone down over the last 2 years and has no prospect of going up for the next 3, even though the own projections of needs from the IMF show that the demands are going to be higher. Second thing I would say is that why is it that so many countries in Africa went to the markets and borrowed at 8, 9, 10, even more %? As we were just discussing in the last panel, Mo said, I think in the last panel, that if you're borrowing at 15%, there's no way you can actually pay that back sustainably if it becomes a significant part of your total borrowing. But why was it that the IMF not able to take some more risk on its own balance sheet and start lending money at 3, 4%, which is what they're lending at to the other countries? It's much better for a Ghana to be able to borrow $2 billion from the IMF at 4 or 5% than it is to go to the market and pay 10 or 11. Now, obviously, you shouldn't do that if at the end of that you still go on and borrow 10 or 12. So there's discipline as part of the package. But I do think that more official financing on terms that don't have to be at 0 interest rate is a better solution than forcing countries to go to the market and borrow at terms that are simply not going to be sustainable. So that's what I would ask the IMF today.
Fantastic. Bertrand, I want to come to you. You're working very hard on the Paris summit. We're all talking about Bridgetown. About 18 months ago, we were all in Paris. We talked about SDRs and the delivery of SDRs and the need for the global financial system to come together and give Africa more liquidity. This is yet another promise. I think President Banda talked about the 100 billion. I'm now sort of a little bit shy about 100 billions because Africa has been promised so many 100 billions. If you do the net present value of it, it's probably 0 today. But why are we not there yet on SDR rechanneling? What else can we do to make sure that we can maybe provide different kinds of liquidity if we cannot get the SDRs out?
No, I think, thank you, and thank you, Mo, for inviting me. I mean, it went way beyond my expectations, to be honest, so congratulations. No, thank you for raising this question. I think the SDR is a real test. This is the real new thing on the table, which is being discussed. We know where there are some blocks, I mean, in the US in particular, but not only. There are a number of technical blocks with central banks here and there, etc. So I don't think it's worth spending too much time here. It's on the table. People are pushing in that direction. But coming back to your question, where do we find the money? You remember when we were together at the World Bank, I led a report called From Billions to Trillions. Unfortunately, we could write the report today, but we have a little bit more billions, but we needed somewhat more trillions. So the equation actually is more difficult to solve today than it was 7 or 8 years ago. And to get to this equation, I mean, we know the various blocks. I mean, you have the domestic block. I mean, how do you mobilize through tax and savings in the domestic market? And you have the international block. And then everybody is focused on the IMF, the World Bank, etc. But whatever perspective you take, they will not solve the problem.
Let me just stop you there on how do you mobilize on the domestic markets. You used to be the MD CFO of the World Bank. Yeah. Why didn't we ever do local currency lending in larger numbers? What was stopping us from doing that?
Well, I've tried. I pushed pretty hard on developing local capital markets. For me, it's absolutely essential. When I was at the World Bank, I say we need 3 types of infrastructure. The physical one, that's what people already have in mind when you say infrastructure, they think roads. Yeah. And then I say you need social, education, and health. And then you need financial infrastructure. If you don't develop financial infrastructure, you will always hit the wall that you mentioned. So I think it's very important that we focus, and that was said by the president of the MasterCard Foundation. We need to support the entrepreneurial spirit on the ground, and part of the toolbox we need to grow is, I mean, banks, pension funds, insurance, etc., which are not at the appropriate level. And for me, that comes to how to close the gap. I mean, from billions to trillions, a big part of the equation will be solved by the private sector. But not the way we've used it for 20 or 30 years, when at the end of the communiqué, we call on the private sector and we expect that money will come from the air and come here. The reality is that the private sector money will not come if we don't change things profoundly. That's for all the reasons you mentioned. You mentioned Basel III. We can mention Solvency II. There are a number of rules that everywhere, the rating agencies, the BBB+ in emerging market is not worth the same as BBB+ in advanced economy from an insurance perspective, of the Solvency II. So there are a number of tricks everywhere that block the system. So unless you touch on this, you will not move the needle. And that's really what is very frustrating today. The reality is that the allocation of money from Europe to emerging markets, so the part of Africa is even tinier, is less than 5%, less than 2% in the US, and it's diminishing. And it's diminishing for reasons that we have to tackle. We cannot ignore them. If we ignore them, we fool ourselves on this private sector money. The reasons why they are diminishing is, I think it was mentioned this morning, interest rates are rising in Europe and America. So why would I take a risk in Africa if I can get safe money and safe returns doing nothing? That's point number one. And then you have all the industrial policy of Europe and the US. Yes. I mean, it's better to put money in solar in Alabama than to go to Africa. And then you have a cultural issue, and I will stop here, which for me is the most dramatic problem. And I was glad that the previous panel addressed this. There is this America First syndrome. I don't care of the rest of the world. I have enough problem at home. This was unfortunately accelerated by COVID. When you spend two years looking at your belly button, you don't care about Africa and the rest of the world. So if the civil society doesn't push, there is little way that the private sector money will come and the government will act decisively.
Sorry, because we have a much shorter session. I have to condense a little bit. But I want to come to you, former Minister of Senegal, Amadou, who you're now a special envoy on infrastructure for the African Development Bank, and ask you a little bit, how do you see the infrastructure landscape, and particularly when we talk today about even climate investment, right? Africa gets only 1% of that whole investment, and the cost of a climate bond today in Africa is 20 times more expensive than it is outside the continent. So the credit rating agencies, the cost and access to capital for us, what is it that we can do differently? Bertrand has talked about the infrastructure, but from a country perspective, what else are you trying to do?
Thank you very much, Vera. First of all, increasing drastically domestic resource mobilization so that our governments relies less on the international sector, number one, and also increasing savings if we can, but families are in difficulty, so people are saving less. But the more we have domestic, the better we are, number one. Number two, you're right, that cost of capital has increased, both from the debt side. We've seen that SOFR, which is the equivalent of LIBOR, going from 0.3% in May 2022 to today 4.8%. This is like risk-free rate, right? And at the same time also, we see the risk premium also increasing. So if you are an African government, if you are borrowing, let's say, 4 years, 4%, let's say on the international market, that same 4 years today, you will pay 10%. Yeah. So it's 600 basis points, like 6%, of interest on $1 billion loan. It's 4 times 60 million is $240 million more that you're going to pay on interest. And this is really big. So what we should focus on then is on the official sector. Unfortunately, as Masoud said, the IMF needs to lend more. The other MDBs need to lend more, right? And on the IMF side, I'll focus on the SDR's reallocation. 2 years ago in Paris, it was a success. We said $100 billion only for Africa. Today, they've been talking about $100 billion, but for all emerging markets and poor countries. It's no longer only for Africa, it's for everybody. Okay, fine, but let me get me the $100 billion. Still, we're at pledges of maybe around $85 to $89 billion of pledge, but what IMF has today in terms of SDRs is not more than $40 billion. Yeah. And so IMF need to get that money out. They're working very hard. I'm sure by end of the year, they will get maybe 10 to 15 countries, give them some money. Rwanda today is the only country that has received $319 million. And because the pledges are not converted into proper SDRs, the IMF that initially said, I'm going to give you 150% of your quota, they're discussing now with some countries to divide that quota by 2. Very poor countries, LICs in Africa that was relying on that money, hoping to get 150%, will get maybe 50% to 75%, dividing the money by 2. So what we need is really the pledges to be converted into SDRs. If you go to the Paris summit in June, and if we can get that before the Paris summit or shortly after, for me, it's the biggest success. But the big problem that we have today, someone has to convince a senator in the US to release the $21 billion. Today, one senator, head of the foreign relations, is not convinced. But
this is why we're here, if I may, because I think when you talk to the Europeans, because there's also the ECB, when you talk to the Europeans and all, they will say there is no Africa voice.
Yeah.
And so the question is Africa organizing itself to be able to do that convincing? I know that President Ellen has been working a lot with the UN on the sort of new reform of the global financial architecture. But how many of us have sort of taken that document, internalized it with our heads of states, so that when we go back out, we can actually do that? Hold that thought. I will come back to you for the answer. But I wanted to go to Mark, since we're seeing you twice. We've all been talking about the Bridgetown Initiative. And if I may, maybe just sort of to unpack the Bridgetown Initiative, it's a little bit of a sort of three-pronged conversation, especially on climate. The first one being, if you get hit by a climate event, that we should immediately suspend all your debt payments so that you can then take care of your populations, a la Malawi, because what has been happening is if you get hit by a climate event, the creditors are saying, hey, you know, your payment was due yesterday. Are we going to declare you in default, or are you paying? And this has been a very difficult choice that we are asking countries to make. And so essentially what we are saying is we immediately suspend payments, you take care of the populations, and then we'll come back to that. The second part of the Bridgetown Initiative is to say, can we create catastrophic bonds where if countries have a climate event or climate shock, that there is a catastrophic payout that immediately happens. We are not going back to have a discussion to renegotiate a loan, but that you immediately get those resources. And the final one is about what do we do with low-income, middle-income countries on the overall conversation around loss and damage, and how do we see progress? And I want to ask you, Mark, do you see progress from COP? What more does the Africa voice, because we're talking about voice, what more can we do to raise that voice and to bring more justice to the conversation on loss and damage to make sure that, you know, again, another pledge gets actually met?
Vera, I mean, I would just add one further goal, which is around debt relief for poor countries.
Yes.
And you know, and it's important to add that because the criticism of Bridgetown has been that it's slewed towards middle-income countries with climate issues. And Mia Motley and Amina Mohammed, who have led on this, you know, are both highly sensitive to that. So there was a sort of Bridgetown 2.0 relaunched at the UN last week, which very explicitly sought to make sure that debt was ensconced there beside these other objectives. And as part of that, you know, there's also now a much closer relationship with the so-called V20, chaired by the Ghana finance minister, which, you know, again has a very strong debt. Because, you know, the one thing we must not do is allow poverty and climate to become these competing objectives. We've got to keep this united. So how are we going to do it, COP28? Well, you know, those who were here in the last session heard me talk about political philanthropy. We strangely were one of 3 organizations in good company with SIF, a fellow foundation, and the government of Scotland as the 3 original donors to the Loss and Damage Fund at Glasgow. And we made the pledge overnight, talk about quick risk capital. And by the time we got to Sharm el-Sheikh, it had legs. But I would say legs and a crutch, because we've got to go the next step, which is, you know, really develop something which bridges between a view of developing countries that this is a, you know, a reparation type arrangement to make up for the damage done to their environments by long-standing industrial emissions from northern countries, and the insurance principle, which is, in a sense, that when a country does suffer damage, a catastrophic event, Pakistan's floods, Malawi's cyclone, that when those things happen, that this fund comes in to support. So it's not just that you get a suspension of your debt repayments, but you get fresh grant finance as well. And we've been talking to the UAE, as many others have, Mia Motley has. We've just got to make sure we get something on the table. I think the UAE are going to be actually a pretty dynamic chair of COP, and we've just got to kind of, in a sense, keep their feet to the fire to make sure we come out with a good outcome.
Thank you. Michael, you are the sort of youth on the panel, and we've been talking a lot about the sort of injustices of the global financial system for Africa. And I am wondering, we haven't seen sort of a youth movement to sort of push the debt resolution conversation. It's a much more complicated and sophisticated conversation, and I'll come to Masood a little bit about that. But what are the youth thinking about when we talk a little bit more about this higher level macro issues? And is there something that we need to do more in terms of educating you, giving you more of the data? I think, again, the report that Mo has just put out is really amazing around sort of what is the voice of Africa and where is it missing? And so if one were to say, how can we get the youth in, what more do we need to do to bring you in, and what are we not doing enough?
All right, thank you very much. One of the first things that I'm going to say is that the authenticity of the African voice really matters. I think at the international level, it's important for us to realize that the way Africa as a continent is perceived is partly shaped by its own policies. So while there need to be reforms at the global level, I think African countries themselves have a critical and large role to play. My second observation relates to the narrative. Can
you be specific when you say that? Because there's been two innuendos about the fact that African governments need to do something, but we never really say what they need to do. So what is it that you, the youth, are expecting from African governments? Because I'm sure it's what the private sector is expecting as well.
Definitely. So in my line of research, I've worked a lot on examining corruption using government-led audit reports. And you'll be surprised to see how much funds are being siphoned out of the government coffers. So when the youth hear about mobilizing additional resources, then the critical question is, where are the existing resources going to? So I think we need first to ensure that we have a stable system of accountability that can now be built upon to mobilize more resources. Otherwise, the narrative year after year is always to mobilize resources and pay higher interest rates. And I think also, as my final observation, it's important for the youth to be part of decision-making processes. I think having a common position on some of these key issues is important. I think development challenges such as debt, trade, illicit capital flows, they are all perennial. Some of us did write essays on that as students. Now we are still working on those things. They don't seem to be much light at the end of the tunnel. So I think that we should try to come up with homegrown solutions to some of these challenges. Let's use the international sphere as a complement to what we are doing and not a substitute. We should not rely on people elsewhere to tell us how to run our affairs.
Thank you so much. In the last panel, we had all the different donors. I think that what we will all raise your hand if is let's get the accountability table going Let's make sure that it is, when we have the next MIF forum, we can say, look, Africa is beginning to become transparent because its youth have asked, and we are putting some more data out. So one commitment, hopefully, that we can take from here. Masood, on the big debt issue, we know that UNECA is working on it, the IMF is working on it. We all talk about the G20 common framework that is clearly not common and not really a framework and not going forward. When you look into history and sort of the big moments of debt resolution, it hasn't really been because, you know, the countries that were debt-ridden were in trouble. It's because the creditors needed to solve the problem. So when you look at East Asia, we needed to make sure that we could correct East Asia very quickly. When you look at Latin America, it was the American community banks that were going to get into trouble. When you look at Greece, it was the German banks. Today, when you look at Africa, because of the diversity of our creditors, there is not one center of influence that can say, let's get around and fix this. So it is this kind of effort that is being put together by UNECA, the IMF, and others to say, can we get a debt roundtable going? What do you think is the success, and what more voice can we bring to this conversation?
I think the debt problem today is at a point where there's broad agreement that what we have doesn't work, but people are struggling to see what you could put in place of it that A, would work, and B, there'd be enough consensus around it so that you could actually put it into place. So what that leads to is two kinds of solutions. One is the official solution, which is let's try and get all the creditors into the tent. Let's make sure, particularly that China, and other non-Paris Club creditors can come inside, respond to their concerns as best as one can. This will take time. We'll find solutions, but it's a very incremental and slow process, and people are not happy with that. Or you get sort of what I call solutions that come out of people having a particular idea and saying, let's do this or let's do that. Very quickly, those ideas run into the same problems that are stopping the current solutions from working. So I think the only way at the moment, it seems to me, is to recognize that even if you go down the path of trying to bring everybody in, it has to be done in a way that is much more urgent and accelerated than to have meetings that take place after gaps of weeks and months rather than gaps of days. There's really no reason why we have one meeting, then we say the next one, we're going to meet in Marrakesh in 6 months. Why not meeting next week? I mean, you know, I think somebody, Andrew Mitchell said this morning, we didn't say when Silicon Valley Bank was collapsing over the week, I'm sorry, it's Saturday. Let's have a meeting on Monday. Actually, I don't work Mondays this week, it's a bank holiday. No, you worked through the weekend, you sorted it out because you needed it done by Monday morning. And that's, I think, if you want to make the official approach credible, it has to be put on steroids. Otherwise, you lose credibility for the official approach, and we really at the moment are struggling to find an alternative approach. I don't know whether we get a chance to come back, Vera, but if I could have 1 minute on another point, which you haven't yet got to, which is practical point this year. There is a momentum to try and deal with the reform of the multilateral development banks, the World Bank, the regional banks. Something will be done over the next 12 months, and my own view is that once it's done, there'll be nothing done for 5 more years. These things come in cycles. It's unlikely that there'll be another big reform in the year after. At the moment, the focus of that reform is primarily to enable these institutions to play a bigger role in supporting climate change and other global challenges. The risk is that the focus of what they should be doing to support Africa is only peripherally in the vision of the design of the reform program. And if there's one thing that I would say, let's put on the table for the next few weeks and months so it gets into the process, it is to have a clear set of views on what it is that we need to incorporate in the reform process so that it's not just fit for purpose to do climate, but also to respond to all the questions we've been dealing over the last 2 days. Fortunately, Vera is on one of the groups that is looking at this, but I think it needs more of an official voice that has a clear set of asks and then a set of putting those into the system. So I just wanted to make that point now.
No, this is and I think you're very right, Masood. One of the comments that we made was that we will bring the MDB reform group to the African finance ministers to make sure, because a lot of the work that President Sirleaf has been doing, the work that the UN has been doing, is getting lost, because the MDB reform is really about middle-income countries. It's about how we increase the capital of the IBRD, how we give concessional money, because the 20 countries that are the most climate inefficient are the ones we want to address. But the problem is, if we focus on those 20 countries, then the rest of us will be drowning when they turn around to focus on us. And so funding also, concessional grant funding for the International Development Association, IDA, which has been dropping since 2012, actually. The resources, and Minister Mitchell is not in the room, but the UK used to be the largest donor to IDA. They have substantially reduced. The US has substantially reduced. Finland has substantially reduced in a couple of seasons where we've had all these crises. So very difficult for Africa to be able to come out of that. But as we say all this, we say then that we need to blend, bring in the private sector, crowd in the private sector. What, in your sense, Bertrand, is needed? What is the G-Funds and Makani say they have $130 billion that they're willing to deploy? What voice does Africa need to make sure that some of that capital can be deployed on the continent?
No, I think the critical point is to hold people accountable for their commitments. I mean, we've heard, you mentioned several times of the hundreds of billions which have been promised over the last 20 years. I remember I was in Libreville with Emmanuel Macron, and he invited civil society to express their views, and the young lady came and said, where is the money? It's as simple as that. And so I think we have to be very serious about everything we do. We have not been very serious with all of this. It's very difficult to say where are the 600 billion promised by the G7, where is the global gateway, and so on and so forth. So I think it's important to be very focused on what is necessary, hold people accountable. The other point is, I've heard so many times blended finance. It's great on paper. I've read a number of reports on blended finance. It's not really working. It's still not at scale, whereas it's still absolutely necessary. And if we cannot properly combine public and private, I come back to my equation from billions to trillions, we are out, we can't speak seriously. And for me, it's absolutely essential that we are serious about this. Again, when you speak to institutional investors, and you mentioned the Mark Carney's Glasgow Alliance, well, I think it was nice, but you see it's under tension now. And it was not about Africa. It was about the world. What is the proportion of these trillions that is going to Africa? It's de minimis. So my real, and I want to emphasize this and finish on this, if we can't make people think that investing in Africa is important and doable and provide them with a proper tool to address the regulatory constraints, it will not work. So we have to propose de-risking at scale. I think and it's a duty not only for the World Bank, but for every multilateral and bilateral institution. If not, there is zero chance that any pension fund, insurance company, etc., will commit money to Africa. It's very unfortunate. I'm trying to do this myself, as you know, but it's extremely challenging. And again, if we don't get there, I mean, whatever the public money or the official money is doing will not be enough. So for me, it's a big elephant in the room. Again, it cannot be the end of the communiqué, and we expect the private sector to fill the gap. We've heard this too many. And to help the private sector, we will develop blended finance. That is impossible. For instance, and let me finish with that, when I was at the World Bank, the greatest surprise for me was MIGA. I was expecting MIGA to be a massive institution, and it's tiny, and it has never lost money. What is insurance companies that has never lost money? Let's be serious. So we have to provide the tools and allow this system to be less risk adverse and to share their experience. Again, secrecy is a name everywhere. So we have to be transparent, we have to be committed. If not, we are fooling ourselves.
Now, I think a very good point there, and I want to link it to a point that you made before. We have on the continent the African Continental Free Trade Area Agreement, and we are continuing. Oh, my mic. I think my mic went off. It fell. Can you hear me? Can you hear me? Thank you. Now, so I want to come to the African Continental Free Trade Area Agreement and link it to a point. And you're wondering, why are we talking about voice and the AFCFTA? There are two things around the AFCFTA that I want to bring to this conversation. If all of you remember, and if you read the FT, or Mo was talking about the FT, Elon Musk, the richest man in the world, was about to go and open an electric vehicle factory in Germany a month ago. Then the IRA happened, and he moved his factory from Germany to Wisconsin in the United States. And he's getting subsidies to produce solar panels. So we get told in Africa, oh, you can crowd in public finance, solar panels are now cheap, but the de-risking is now we have to de-risk Elon. We have to give him the subsidy that the US is giving him to stay in America to go to Senegal. Can we afford that? Seriously. And so when we look at the AFCFTA, and we just saw Chile ban exports of lithium because they want to process in Chile, and we saw Mexico do the same thing. As we work on the AFCFTA, and AU Chair, you're here, is it the moment also for Africa to use its voice around the AFCFTA to get more from the international community on some of these conversations? Because I think if they just tell us, no, you have to de-risk, but then in Europe, and Kun didn't talk about it, but we know that the Europeans are trying to put an equivalent IRA, Pascal, you're here, to compete with the Americans. We will never be able to compete with the Europeans competing with the Americans. Forget about the Chinese. And so where is the Africa voice? How can we organize ourselves to do that? And Amadou, you have been doing a lot of sort of international cooperation work. How do you see this conversation with our partners?
Vera, when I was minister, together we tried to prepare for G20 meetings and all of that, to put everybody together. It was very informal. To me, probably in the same way the EU does it, the African Union should have maybe a mechanism where it's finance ministers. We see the EU foreign ministers meeting before an AU summit. But we have never seen finance ministers of Africa or development economy ministers meeting before an AU summit to agree on financial and economic issues and put them forward for our leaders. I think that maybe should start to happen. In particular, hopefully that Africa will have a seat at the G20. We got to make sure we use that seat also wisely so that we can defend our interest. Just very quickly, Vera, on the international financial architecture. For me, what has been unfair has been that whenever there have been a crisis, the developed world, the big countries, manage to print money. You hear trillions of dollars. During COVID, $20 trillion. Can we have a system where whenever they print money, 20 trillion, we have a mechanism where Africa gets a percentage of that automatically? Because it's not fair that they managed to print $20 trillion and we are talking about 100 billion, 150 billion. I think that could be maybe a big thing that Africa can ask. On the US Senator, I come back to that. Gail is here, she's been working on that. Many foundations have been working on that. But I think it's about time that Africa takes that one seriously. Our leaders, I don't know at what level, should maybe go to America or invite the senator or use lobbyists or use corporations that work with that senator. Because what I heard was that actually he believes that some of that money, if the US released the 21 billion, may go to some countries outside Africa that they don't want the money to go to. You can do some carve-out, you can do some structures where the US money is maybe ring-fenced and it does not go to where they don't want it to go. But it should not be a hindrance. And I believe that we need those SDRs reallocation because our developed partners are in trouble themselves. Interest rate has gone up even for themselves. It will be very highly unlikely for them to borrow at high interest rate to give us the grant. Yeah. Whenever interest rate went up, you see ODA going down. UK this year, they dropped down their ODA participation. Why? Because rates have gone up. many countries will do the same. So let's focus on the SDR reallocation to the IMF, but to MDBs as well. Give it to the African Development Bank to do the leverage 1 to 4. It's cheap liquidity. Even it will be at 4%. It's better than borrowing at 10%.
Exactly.
Thanks.
No, very good, very good. One point I want to come back to you on. You mentioned the United States many times. There is an elephant in the room, China. How is the interaction with China? What should we do more? What should we do differently? We've always been saying that maybe we need a constellation of African finance ministers that go and have a discussion with China. We have seen China forgive the debt of Angola. A lot more debt than it has to Zambia, by the way. We have seen China restructure Ethiopia's debt, a lot more than it had to Zambia. And we talk about comparability of treatment, but we know that the Chinese like extension of maturity, reduction in cost. But where is Africa's voice to China in saying, maybe the common framework cannot be that common, but there is a way where we restructure this debt? What is the voice that we need for that? Because I really think, yes, we can beat up on the US, but they're in the room with us, and Jing Yong is also here with us. But what is the engagement and the voice that Africa has to have with China?
To me, actually, when dealing with China, except maybe on FOCAC, most countries would just deal on a bilateral basis. I think China likes to deal with Africa globally through FOCAC. We're going to invest in this, we're going to do this, and most of the time they do those things. But on a country by country, when a country has a problem or there is something, they like the bilateral relationship.
But is it time that because now we have a common problem. We have a common debt problem.
And so the suggestion to have these ministers of finance of Africa working with the AU, like the foreign ministers doing their work with AU, having those finance ministers also gather and engage China on these issues might be an efficient way to do it. But we cannot do this without finance ministers. I mean, a lot of decisions at the AU don't concern the finance ministers. No, nowhere. No development minister, no finance minister, there's nobody. And there is nowhere in the world where you have an a union without the finance people. They have the money, they have the fiscal, they're the one making big decisions, and they're nowhere to be found.
Right.
Okay.
Mark, your turn. I wanted to come to you and ask you about what is I think we are struggling with how we engage our partners. Yeah. We listened to Janet Yellen the other day say, national security is my priority. I would only invest through national security. How do we organize ourselves now as Africa? Because if you're DRC, you can't sell electric vehicles or batteries to Janet because you have to go through the national security filter. What is the conversation that platforms like yours can help us maybe bring back that conversation to a more economic global growth? Because we still believe growth is what's going to take us out of poverty, but we can't do it through national security only.
Well, when you and I have talked about should there be a new think tank for Africa, we've said it should be about trade and economics and foreign policy, because this national security dimension, like it or not, has returned to the front. And I think everybody has to wake up to the fact that and the Europeans have been the last to wake up to it, that the era of globalization is over. The era of markets determining the allocation of wealth around the world.
So do you think we're also going to de-dollarize?
No, I don't necessarily think we're going to de-dollarize, but it's certainly not impossible. But I think we're into a period of really fundamental shifting tectonic plates of what the global political economy is going to look like. And that has risks for Africa, but also opportunities for Africa. And I think, my own view is that what we've been talking about so far, the Bridgetown Initiative, the Paris Summit, etc., we're going to be squeezing some more toothpaste out of the tube. We will get, I hope, those SDRs, we'll get some debt clauses, we'll get some debt relief. But, it's nowhere near Bertrand's trillions. And that is going to take a complete reset of the global system. So I think we have to look at this in two horizons. What in an era of high interest rates, political caution, prioritizing national security we can achieve, and then a somewhat longer term ambition to boot the system, and that needs three things. And Michael, you touched on one. It's easy to start just say more money, but that more money has to come, as you so eloquently argued, with accountability of the receiving governments. But the third element is that accountability in the past has been forced down governments' throats through both an austerity model, but also a model which grew up in the era of colonialism. I'm not saying it was a colonial model, but it was shaped by the power structures of the post-Second War world where these institutions were born. We now have to move into a new era of much greater ambition to end poverty, green our world, and create jobs for all those who need them, which is a scale of investment way beyond what we have considered so far. And that requires us moving this system to, if you like, from a colonial, and I'm uncomfortable with the word, but to a cooperative system. And it requires one last thing. It requires the involvement of the private sector. Not so much necessarily the FDI blended finance side of it, as Bertrand argued, but the sort of securitization, the use of pension funds to, essentially buy the mortgage, to buy the lending of the official institutions and free them to lend again. And, but that again returns on this issue of Michael's accountability, because, only when you have high-quality, accountable government in countries with transparent economic plans, no leakage of funds to bank accounts in the Cayman Islands or Switzerland, but money clearly, transparently deployed for development, have you created the groundwork for that? And I'm sorry, I know it's over, but I can't resist one dig at my European friends in this room. It's not just the multilateral system which isn't ready for Horizon 2. Listening very patiently to the European partnership with Africa as described, it is also half pregnant. It simply has not embraced the fact that Europe has a bigger problem in the future than Africa. Condemned by geography to be Africa's neighbor, it has the opportunity to either be in a real partnership to build Africa, both around human resources, but around natural resources and shared markets. Or it continues with this sort of hand-to-mouth philanthropy.
We are 8 hours away between Dakar and Washington, D.C., so we're also close to the United States, just to say. But you're right. Michael, I will come to you very quickly for a last word. I think visibly everybody agrees with your and congratulations, because you dared to put the C word out there. And we are now giving you the challenge of building something that will help us monitor accountability and hopefully fight corruption. So as we go forward, what are you going to deliver for us? You're the youth. You make miracles. You do it tomorrow.
All right,
and you have a room here that can support you.
So here's the thing.
1 minute.
We should try to build linkages between these macro issues and human development at the local level. And I think given the dynamics of the African population, if we don't invest in the youth, there are going to be ramifications in terms of peace and security, migration, and all these development issues. So it could be a step forward, but also a step backwards. I think we should be inclusive in the way we sort of design our policies and ensure that the youth, especially those who are frustrated and are in rural villages, are able to feel that they are part of the society and actually somebody is thinking about them.
Thank you so much. I just want, before we leave, there is one important bookmark, which is the IDA replenishment in Tanzania in December. This is the replenishment for the next big liquidity injection that we will be able to get, and we're fighting for 108 billion to make sure that we don't go backwards from the IDA during COVID. And I think we need to bring everybody around the table. This is real resources that we can actually deliver. So it's saying we need IDA, We need more IDA, and we need it quickly, and I hope that we can all rally around the President of Tanzania as we do the midterm replenishment of IDA to make sure that the low-income countries get the resources that they need for climate, for human development, and for infrastructure. Thank you so much, and sorry we went 5 minutes over. Sorry. I think so. Thank you.